welcome to another episode of the TFD Performance Podcast. In today's episode, we're continuing on with the endurance series, and we're going to be talking all about the importance of fluid and electrolyte intake for endurance athletes, and why it's important to not only ensure you are eating enough, but also nailing your hydration. We also talk about the impact overheating can have on performance and the importance of thermoregulation. Geordie, welcome back to another episode of our TFD Performance Podcast. We've had a little bit of a break in the schedule while you're off gallivanting in the States, so welcome back.
Yeah, thanks, Loz. Good to be back.
Yeah, absolutely. And I bet you've just been absolutely cannot wait to get back into this podcast series so that we can talk about all things fluid and electrolytes, just to wrap up our little endurance series. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I've just spent 12 days in a house full of 20 fighters, so I'm pretty sick of talking about nutrition for fighting. So endurance is a nice change. Absolutely.
And I think, obviously, I guess it kind of does coincide because you're monitoring sweat rate and obviously hydration status with the fighters, but how that translates into endurance athletes and endurance sports is different, but there are still some similarities there. So I think in today's episode, obviously, we're going to be talking specific to endurance sports, but about the importance of fluid and electrolyte intake for endurance athletes. And why it's not only important to obviously dial in your nutrition, but also make sure that you're nailing your hydration as well, because if anyone's listening to this, you've probably experienced cramps or fatigue or overheating or going to the toilet too much or not even going to the toilet. So there's a lot of kind of implications that can arise if you don't nail your fluid and electrolytes. But to be honest, it can be quite overwhelming because I suppose there's a lot of mixed research out there into the supposed benefits or the strategies that we should be employing for endurance athletes. But straight off the bat, Geordie, I know you've been experiencing a little bit with your own personal running endeavors. Do you want to give us a little bit of a synopsis into what you've been trialing recently with your running and your fluids and your electrolytes?
Yeah, sorry, I need to put this on silent. But yeah, hydration's a funny one. Like, I think the more you learn about and the deeper you go on the rabbit hole, the more confusing it gets, right? But I think there's definitely some basics. And I think once you get the basics right, and I found this in my own training, is like the basics being figuring out if you're a heavy sweater or you're not a heavy sweater. And I think most people innately or intuitively will understand that. I think just simply weighing yourself before and after will give you a pretty good idea. And that's something that was pretty shocking for me, especially when I transitioned into like long endurance events, like just how much fluid I was losing during those events. And I think we often hear about this, and we'll talk about it later, like the 2% rule, right? Like the 2% body weight loss, and then you start getting all these detriments. What I've come to learn from both doing this myself and working with lots of athletes is that that's very, very individual. Like some athletes have a really good tolerance for being somewhat dehydrated, and then some athletes absolutely do not. And they get even less dehydrated from that, and you start seeing negative consequences. So even with my own training, I've been going through a lot of this is like, okay, well, where is that point for you? Like, what are the factors that contribute to that? And where is the point of dehydration where you do start seeing these negative side effects of, not having enough fluid in your system? And it's very interesting. It's very eye-opening. I think it's definitely improved my performance a lot. It's improved my recovery a lot. And it's improved how I think about my overall nutrition strategy, because hydration is something I think we overlook a lot. Like we think about, okay, let's get our carbs and our gels and everything and make sure outside of that, we've got our really good diet in place throughout the week. So we're really good recovering and performing well. But we really overlook hydration. I think people just think, if I get all that other stuff right, everything will look after itself. So I highly encourage anyone listening to this, take notes in this, because no matter what sport, we're talking about endurance now, and it is super important for endurance, but every sport, like it's ubiquitous across all sports. I find most athletes either struggle with their hydration or they just simply overlook it.
Absolutely. And, depending on kind of where you get your statistics from, like our human body, we're made up of, up to 75% water. So that just goes to show how important it is for us to prioritize this during training, because you're right. Obviously, there's, we've talked about carbs, and there's some pretty good recommendations in terms of how much you should be aiming to have per hour. Of course, that's individual, but I think when it comes to fluid and electrolytes, it's super individual because we all have different sweat rates. We all have different kind of sweat composition in terms of, are we a salty sweater or are we not a salty sweater? So I think a really good place to start would be, you don't have to go out and get a fancy sweat test done unless, you've got the materials there, you've got access to someone that can do it for you. But even just in training, weigh yourself before you go for a ride, for example. Take note of how much liquid you're consuming during that ride. Weigh yourself again at the end of your session And whatever that difference is, that's, say your approximate sweat loss. And then to rehydrate, you want to times that by 125 to 150%. But doing that in training can help you to get a really good understanding of what your sweat rate is like. Obviously, it's not going to tell us the composition of electrolytes in your sweat, but it's a really good way to get a better idea of, okay, how much fluid am I losing in a session, so that come race day, you can try and mimic this to the best as possible. Because obviously, if you're doing, say, a triathlon, you're going to be swimming, you're going to be riding, you're going to be running, depending on whatever your event is. Obviously, it's quite a long duration event. You're not going to be able to always match your output. It's hard. You can't rely on thirst as an indicator of hydration requirements while you're exercising, but having that background understanding of how your body sweats is going to really help moving forward in terms of determining your fluid needs.
Yeah, there's an important consideration I think everyone should think about is it's super individual. Like you'll never get two individuals that are exactly the same. You could go to a triathlete club and a triathlon club rather, and you could look at 20 different individuals and you might just have 4 or 5 that are real heavy sweaters and really heavy salt sweaters. And then like 10 that are kind of in the middle. And then the rest are just at the other end of the spectrum where they're quite low. And the way you design this hydration and electrolyte strategy for each of them is going to be different, right? And I think if you do identify as one of those heavy sweaters for one, and then a heavy salt sweater as well, meaning you lose a lot of, say, sodium in your salt, you really do have to look at this, because you can go back and forth and you can look at the research and go, oh, how much does it really play into your performance? When I don't think we're quite there where we can say at a definitive number, this is going to happen. If you're this much dehydrated, you've lost this much sodium, this is going to, we're so far from that. It's not funny, but anyone that participates in these events, and if you are a heavy salt sweater and you are a heavy sweater, I am one of them, you feel it. Like you definitely feel it. Like, and it's interesting talking to people who aren't like that are low salt sweaters, low sweaters, and they can just keep going and they don't have to take this as seriously. They do have to take it seriously, but not as attentive. And then understanding, okay, I am losing all of this. What is my strategy? Like, how much do I have to theoretically get in? Do you have to get all of that in during that race or during that training? We don't know yet. We don't know how much of that you do have to get in. What we do know, though, is afterwards, if you've decreased your total body water, it's probably going to be very advantageous to get a good portion of that 125 to 150% back in, more so for your recovery, and then to make sure that you're starting your next session well hydrated.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially for those of you who are listening and you train multiple times a day and or you train in hot environments. We were just talking about this off air before about the impact, more so we think of heat as opposed to just fluid and electrolytes. But yeah, if you're training multiple times a day, having that fluid in after your session is going to be super important. And, when we talk about electrolytes, just for some context, in case you're not really sure what electrolytes are, the common ones that we talk about with regards to sports nutrition is sodium, so salt, magnesium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, chloride. So all of these play various functions throughout our body. And you can get these naturally from foods. However, in the context of sports, generally we're going to be getting these from a tablet or a powder or a pre-made sports drink. So that's your Trainade, Powerade, Gatorade, all those types of things. And depending on what works best for you or what's the best method of delivery, you could be having salt tablets, you could be having Trainades made up, you could be having sports gels. So it's obviously, again, as with everything, is finding an individual, like a way that is the best for you. So hand in hand is electrolytes and fluid. And when it comes to endurance, one of the most hyped electrolytes is sodium, so salt. And that's because of the role it plays in fluid balance. As you mentioned before, Geordie, obviously sodium helps us to retain fluid. So it's like that conversation again of, okay, well, is it this impact of the electrolytes that we supposedly have this performance benefits from, or is it the fact that sodium can help us to retain water and therefore, ensure that we are hydrated? So it's, again, those holes in the research of, okay, at what point are we actually getting benefits from these electrolytes?
Yeah, I think when you break it down, right, and you want to find like the mechanistic cause of why you see detriments in performance or why some people can get through races without having sodium, you can get kind of in the weeds with it. It's like, well, what role is the sodium having? Are you replacing lost sodium that's lost from parts of the body, or is that sodium playing a role in restoring fluid volume? We're not quite sure. We know fluid volume is super important. One thing that you do know if you do practice with a lot of endurance athletes is that for your heavy salt sweaters, you see an immediate difference. Like I've had guys that, let's just say the average sweat loss, I think if you read the papers, it's like 1,000, 1,100 megs per liter of sweat. So if like you think about like your average Gatorade, like endurance or something, will have 365. So that's putting in 3 Gatorades per liter of sweat. If you're sweating 2 liters per hour, that's getting in 6 Gatorades. So it kind of makes sense. If you don't need that much fluid, let's add to these electrolyte tablets. If you've got guys that are very, very high salt sweat, they can be losing up to 2,000 milligrams per liter, 2,500 milligrams per liter. You're going to see a detriment. If those guys aren't getting it, it might not be in the first hour, it might not be in the second hour, but if they're going 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 plus hours, they've got to be getting that back in. And you absolutely see that. And I've had clients where that's the single biggest issue. And that's the biggest issue, like biggest solution to a lot of issues that they have, whether that's fatigue, whether that's energy, whether that's the ability to hold fluid in their body. Like you said, they're stopping and always going to the bathroom can be a sign that you don't have enough electrolytes to physically hold that fluid in your body. That is usually one of the first things that we look for. You know, we ask them, hey, are you, when you're sweating, is it like stinging around your eyes where you got little cuts or wherever on your face? Are you tasting salty things? Good thing I always say to like cyclists who stop and get coffee at cafes is like, are the dogs coming up and licking your legs? Because they'll come up and lick the salt off your legs. If you're a heavy salt sweater, looking into how much you're actually losing is super important. That's why getting, say, a sodium sweat test, if you're a serious endurance athlete, is so valuable, because you might just be losing 1,000 meds, and that's a pretty easy amount to replace. And you can have that question, oh, do I really need to replace that, or can I just get it in my food? But if you're at the top end of that, 2,000, 2,500, you're probably going to see some detriment later on in your training or race day if you don't replace it. And then you need to find supplements that are going to be adequate to get that back in. Really, really, really important.
Yeah, and I think on one of our previous episodes, we touched briefly on, fluid and electrolytes. And I'd mentioned I'd read one article saying that sodium requirements or suggested intakes for endurance athletes were 500 to 600 milligrams an hour. And that's great if you're a low salt sweater. But if you, like you mentioned, the average person is sweating up to 1,100 milligrams per liter of sweat, where is that coming into? So it's like, as well, there's, not necessarily guidelines out there that can just make it super easy in terms of dictating an individual's requirements. So I think, if you have the ability to, getting a sweat test is great, because you've done it with some of the fighters, Geordie, and it's pretty insane, what values you get. Yeah,
the difference, like the spread is nuts. And like I've done it with endurance athletes too. And like you see it, I've done it with lots of different athletes, and there's such a spread. I think there's a stat going around in some literature, like in soccer, in football, if you're from Europe and the UK listening to this, is that if you sweat test an entire football team, is that only about 5% of them will come back as really high salt sweaters and need an individual electrolyte and hydration strategy. And that's like not that much, like, especially if you think about 5%, you got 100 athletes, only 5 of them will really need to dial this in. And that's probably accurate. That's probably the ones that really need to dial in. But for those guys, you absolutely need to have a strategy. And if you are one of those athletes and you're listening to this and going, oh, I am getting cramps, you know what, like I'm really struggling with like fatigue, or I hit this wall and it's like, I've got my fueling and everything else on pat, and I'm sleeping well and training properly. Maybe this is something that you need to look into.
Absolutely. And obviously there's, multiple electrolytes, but sodium is one of the predominant ones that we do lose through sweat. So that's why we're always harping on about making sure you're having supplements with sodium in them. And I suppose, mentioning the cramping thing, obviously that's a big issue with endurance athletes, is muscle cramping. And one of the first things that comes to mind is, oh my gosh, I'm not having enough electrolytes, or I'm depleted in electrolytes. And there's a lot of info, there's a lot of research in there towards exercise-induced muscle cramps. And they are highly, multifactorial, but there's not a lot of clear evidence kind of pertaining to, okay, electrolyte depletion is the sole, cause of muscle cramping. It comes into, again, that conversation of, okay, how much does nutrition and hydration have as opposed to your physical conditioning? And then as well brings into muscle glycogen depletion. So it's like, yes, okay, of course, electrolytes are going to be super important for managing muscular cramps, because sodium is really important for our nerve signaling and our muscle contraction. So if we don't have enough sodium, naturally, those two processes are going to be impaired. However, that theory, so there's multiple theories as to why cramps occur, the electrolyte imbalance, and dehydration theory. So that's saying that obviously depletion can be linked to severe muscle cramping. And while obviously, yes, it is a big factor, it's not the only factor. And I think there's quite a lot of poor research out there as well. So I think obviously managing your nutrition, your hydration, and your fluid, your electrolytes is super beneficial in terms of trying to mitigate the risk of having cramps, but it's not going to magically solve the problem of having cramps.
Yeah, and it's important to realize with cramps, it's like multifactorial, as you said, Loz, and it can be hugely genetic, right? Like some people are just more prone to it. And whenever I get an athlete and they come to me and they say, hey, I'm getting cramps, it's like, well, there's a few things we need to tick off here. And like, yes, we need to look at your fueling. Do you have enough glycogen? Because we know that maybe there is a link that if you run out of glycogen, it can disrupt your calcium balance, and then that could cause some cramps. Maybe it is an electrolyte and a sodium balance. Maybe you're a heavy salt sweater. We need to look down that. Maybe it's just your overall fluid and hydration in that muscle. The other thing I always look at and make sure to consider is, like you said, your overall conditioning. Like, we know if you push muscles physically to their limit, they're going to somehow, at some stage, they're going to break down. They're going to cause some disruption into that nerve signaling, and that we can see cramps there. So it's really multifactorial. Again, it's like, if you have cramps and we don't know how to nail each single one, you kind of do the shotgun approach and you go, okay, well, let's look at all of these. Let's get your hydration right. Let's get your fueling right. Let's get your electrolyte, and let's look at your conditioning. And I think, on another note, like you said, when we're talking about all of this, conditioning is really important. I think we need to appreciate that. Like, if we're talking about hydration and electrolytes and all of this, and, people needing, and we were talking off air, I see people going for like a 5K run and they're like, oh, I've got like my water bottle and my electrolytes and all this. And it's like, you probably don't need that. Like, you probably don't need that, but you're probably not conditioned enough where a 5K run is super easy yet, where you can just go. And so having that fluid and that carbohydrate on board, probably mentally more than anything, but does to a degree help the physical conditioning to get you to a point where you can just go out for a 5K and you don't have to run out. Like, I train with lots of people who can go out for 30Ks and not sip on anything. Like, is that the best for their performance and recovery? That's a different convo. But their body is super conditioned to be able to just do that. Like, they're super conditioned. You get ultra endurance runners who run 250K plus races. They can easily go out for a 30, 35K, 40K run and not put anything in, because they're just so conditioned and their body is so adapted to be able to do it. So that's an important consideration. In saying all of that, the other side of the coin, like I said, you've got to do a lot of work to get to that point. And that's where your nutrition, your hydration, getting your electrolyte strategy is really important, because to get that conditioning, it's just day in, day out training, right? So you've got to be able to consistently do that and recover from that training. That's where nutrition is the glue that holds all that together. When you're getting that fueling strategy right, you're getting your hydration strategy, your electrolyte strategy right, you're helping glue together all of the adaptations that you're getting from that training and recovery.
Yeah, I think, was it last episode or something, you said training is king and nutrition is queen or something? Yeah, so they do go hand in hand. And of course, yeah, we could give you all the advice in the world, but if you're not putting in the work, on the pavement, on the bike, in the pool, probably, your nutrition is going to help too much. But it's absolutely essential in building the foundations and getting you to that level that you want to be, and also, in our training periods. But I suppose with, electrolytes and fluid, it all comes back to the dreaded, dehydration. Ultimately, we want to try and preserve body fluids as much as possible, because, as I said, our body is largely made up of water. Our muscles as well, largely made up of water, around 70-75%, because fluid, we need to have, that lubrication in our muscles, helps with nerve signaling. So in terms of trying to avoid dehydration as much as possible, of course, there's that 2% number, which you can go into, Geordie, because you mentioned, at what point is this? Where did this 2% come from? Did someone just pick this number and say, you know what? I think when dehydration hits 2%, your performance is going to decrease. So it's like, obviously, again, it's going to be highly individual, but we really want to avoid dehydration, because when our water loss exceeds our water intake, our blood volume can become quite thick. And obviously, the more thick our blood is, the harder our body has to work to pump that around our body, to supply fresh oxygenated blood to our working muscles, which can obviously lead to implications such as fatigue, feeling a bit lightheaded, being a bit slow, having those cramps, having pains and everything like that. So the aim of the game obviously is to try and prevent that as much as possible. If that's 2%, don't know. But as we mentioned, it's obviously quite hard to match fluid loss with fluid intake whilst you're exercising, because apart from the fact that it's not always practical to have, okay, I know I'm going to lose 2 liters in this, right? I need to smash 2 liters of water. That's not practical, because you don't want to obviously have that fluid on board, and maybe need to go to the bathroom, but also the logistical implications of being on a bike or running or swimming. All of these things also impact the amount of fluid that you're able to get in. So it's quite a big picture in terms of when we're thinking, yeah, we know what we need to get in, or I know my sweat loss, I know my fluid loss, like, okay, yeah, cool, I've got all these numbers. It's like, okay, well, are you actually going to have the capacity to be able to consume this? So then it's like, okay, getting that individual kind of solution in a way of an electrolyte balance that's going to work for you. That's where things like Trainer do come in handy, because you have an idea of, how much sodium and potassium is going to be in each serve. And it's almost like a dose that you can individualize to yourself. So I think supplements like that come in really handy. But yeah, in terms of that dehydration, the 2%er, what are your views, Geordie?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's a few points I want to make here, and I think we'll start at the 2% because, like I said, it's very individual for everyone, right? And I think there's a good deal of literature that shows like top elite level marathon runners, like they generally finish that race 4 to 5% dehydrated, right? And there's that classic old study of Gabriel Salesi in the Dubai World Championship when he attempted to break the world record. He finished 10% dehydrated, and he's performing at an elite level. I think the conversation is very interesting. It can get very intricate because, like you said, there's a logistical side of this. And I think time is one of the things we don't talk about enough with this. If you're going out and running a 5 or 10K, like you're only really going to be out there for like an hour, maybe an hour longer. Like if you're moderately well trained, even if if you're getting more elite, way less than that. So do you need, like, how dehydrated are you going to get in that time? I think the conversation gets more important, even when you go up to the marathon. Don't get me wrong. The marathon, if you're doing it pretty well, 2 to 3 hours is a decent amount of time. Are you going to get your body so dehydrated to a point where it's hugely going to be a disadvantage for you in your performance and recovery? We don't know. I think there's two things you need to talk about when you talk about that. Is one, we know when you get more dehydrated, you might say, hey, Loz, you need 2 liters per hour. But we know the longer time that goes on, that sweat rate is going to slow down, because as you lose total body fluid, we know you can't really match this 1-to-1. And we'll talk about after this, if you overmatch it and you over put in too much fluid, you can get the risk of hyponatremia, which we have seen in these shorter events. It's very difficult to match those. But as you go on in time, you go 3, 4, 5+ hours, anyone who's done longer events, you realize you can't put in 2 liters per hour, and you're probably not your sweat rate is going to slow down. You're probably not going to keep losing as it goes on. It's just the mechanics of how your body works, the way that it pushes fluid out from your blood onto your skin, and then in different compartments of your body, it will slow down. So it might be 2 liters per hour, might be 1.5 liters the next hour. And this is interesting. And I think I've learned this a lot coming from what I do weight cutting with the fighters, right? Where you're sitting in a room, in a bath or a sauna or whatever for sometimes 4, 5, 6 hours. And you're literally just checking this every hour. You always see, as they get more dehydrated, that sweat rate slows down. So that's an important consideration to keep in mind if you're doing these longer endurance events, is that your sweat rate will slow down. So you need to understand, again, how has this changed? Like in this 2-hour session, how much did I lose? In this 3-hour session the next weekend, how much did I lose? So maybe my sweat rate is changing every hour and a half or whatever. Having a good understanding of that is really important. The second important thing to talk about this, and you can go pretty deep with this one, we'll keep it pretty up here just for the audience's sake, is overheating. Because overheating is going to do 2 things. It's going to affect the amount that you actually sweat, because as your body heats up more, you're going to sweat more. And 2, there is a negative consequence of your body heating up. Like your body heating up, your sweating is just a cooling mechanism to decrease that heat in your body. Heating can denature proteins. It can cause all these detrimental things in your body. So you have this conversation of, okay, well, what's causing more of a negative effect? Is it the fact that you're dehydrating to 2%? Or is it the fact that your body's overheating, you can't manage it? And obviously, as you train more, you get better at sweating. That's why you see more well-trained athletes. They'll usually have a faster onset of sweating. They'll usually sweat more because they get a more efficient cooling system, which some argue suggests that overheating may be more of a bigger issue than dehydration itself. And it's interesting. And I'll take an example. We're just talking about this, Loz. Like, I train every day. Like every day I'm running at least 20 kilometers, and I can go out and bang 20 kilometers out pretty easily, 30 kilometers pretty easily. And I don't even have to take out water or fluid or whatever. I can do that in Brisbane right now. We're in winter. I wake up, our winters aren't that cold, but say it's 7, 8 degrees, and I'll wear a hoodie and go out, and I'm still kind of chilly. You still sweat, but you don't see the detrimental effects that I saw when I was in Las Vegas 2 weeks ago, when I was in the summer, when it was 40 degrees Celsius in a dry desert heat, when I'm running around and I'll do 20 Ks out there, where I lose, one, you sweat so much more because you're overheating. And then you see the detrimental effects of overheating. You almost go into that risk of heat stroke and heat exhaustion. You physically have to stop and let your body get in the cool shade and let your body cool down, or get ice pack over you, or go into a gas station with aircon to allow your body to cool down. And you're getting that fluid in because you're sweating it out so fast. And the cooling effect of having cold fluids is really important. So it's an interesting convo. And I don't necessarily know if we know which one has a greater effect, because really they're 2 sides of the same coin, right? And it would be really cool to do studies. I've always thought, like, let's get studies where people dehydrate independent of overheating. And then let's get the same people to come in and we'll do the same amount of dehydration with overheating. Like put them in a really hot room, do the same amount of dehydration, see what the numbers work out. Because coming from someone who does a lot of training and does a lot of these events and these longer events that go on and on, personally, I think if you're a body that can sustain a certain amount of dehydration, you can probably push yourself a lot further. Like you see in these marathon races, these Gabriel Celestis pushing themselves 5, 6, 7% dehydration and finishing pretty well, like really elite level. But it's really hard to do that when you're overheated. It's really hard to continue when you're overheated. Overheating can be so detrimental to your body, like it can literally kill you. So it's a very interesting balancing act. And I know people listening to this going, okay, cool. What's the solution then? And I just think, well, if it's hot, you're going to overheat. You need cooling strategies. Like you need fluid for one, because you're going to be losing a lot of fluid. Definitely going to need that. And you're probably going to need cooling strategies, whether that's ice in your cap or you're stopping, sitting in the shade, making sure you've got your body enough time to cool down and actually sweat and cool down. Going to be really important. If it's cooler, you're probably still going to dehydrate. You're going to get that out, but you've probably got a bit more of a buffer room because you're not going to overheat as much. But that doesn't mean that you can just ignore your hydration strategy. If you're going to be dehydrating, you need to put in, it's probably just going to happen at a way slower rate in that cooler environment. I think that's probably going to be the take home message from that little ramble there.
No, it's super important. And as well, water, our body water is responsible for thermoregulation. So in a way, it's like, okay, yes, the overheating is an issue, but also being dehydrated can impair our body's ability to thermoregulate. So it's like, okay, yes, they can be independent, but they are still intertwined in a way. So it's like, if there's any PhD students, we've got any researchers out there and that want to get involved, obviously that'd be a great idea, I think, to study.
Yeah. And I think it's important, right? And we're talking about very specifics, but if you're just listening to this and you want like a practical, like take home message, like figure out how much you sweat for your event, whatever it is, the distance it is, how much do you sweat over 2 hours, and then see how you change in those different environments. This is why we encourage so many people to do heat acclimation, for example, because doing heat acclimation, which is exposing yourself to training in hot environments, it changes the way your body regulates your heat and controls your body temperature. Like your fluid volume increases, you get a faster onset of sweat, the sweat composition changes, all things that are favorable that lead to you being more efficient at cooling your body and preventing that overheating. But again, like Loz says, it's two in the same thing. Like the fluid in your body is what is thermoregulating your body. So very, very advantageous, very, very individual. But I highly encourage everyone, figure out what you are losing in your training sessions, figure out what your hydration strategy is, and then even look at using some type of heat acclimation to improve your body's ability to thermoregulate and prevent that overheating.
Really good point, because a few people that I've spoken to that are doing, say, Ironmans, in terms of preparing their nutrition plan, they'll have a look at, okay, what supplements or what's going to be available at the aid stations at this event. And they'll start incorporating those types of gels or those types of supplements into their training nutrition plan. We should do the same, encourage the same with climates. Do you live in, Tasmania, but you're going to be doing the Cairns Ironman? You know what I mean? Like if you're looking into, okay, yep, I'm familiar with the nutrition supplements that are going to be available to me on the course. Okay, even to be honest, if we're thinking about, managing thermoregulation and our hydration status, being switched on to, okay, what type of climate am I actually going to be competing in, especially if you train in a different environment to where you're going to be competing. Practicing heat acclimation strategies would be really awesome. And just being able to determine how your body reacts to different types of temperatures, because I obviously wasn't running 20-30 Ks like you, Geordie, but when I was up in Mount Isa at the beginning of the year, I only ran 8 Ks one day, and I think it was 42 degrees, and it was probably the most awful experience I've ever had in my life. I was shaking when I stopped. I was shivering because I was hot, but I was so cold. And I could have kept running. I only did 7 Ks, but I physically could not run anymore because I was just so hot. I was hot, but my body was like cold, and I had goosebumps. And I thought I really just had to go to the toilet. I thought I was going to be sick. So I think thermoregulation, obviously, this podcast is about hydration and electrolytes. But I think, thermoregulation could be also something that we could delve into a little bit more, because I think you're right, and it has a huge impact on how we're actually able to push through those events and train in those uncomfortable conditions.
Yeah, this is why you see like Olympic athletes, right? If they're like Tokyo, what was that, 2020 Tokyo Olympics, such a hot environment, is why so many athletes had to do heat acclimation. And when you get the Northern Hemisphere athletes who are coming from those cooler environments, right, that they're coming back down, they have to do heat acclimation to get ready for that heat. And so many elite level athletes do that. And it's like, even on the local scene, like I know, like training in Brisbane or this time of year, like Brisbane's kind of humid, but if you go up to Cairns and do an Ironman or ultra, whatever in cans, you need to get used to that increased humidity. You need to get used to that increased heat. That's something that you absolutely have to get used to. And you see it everywhere. Like I remember, I think it was last year, coming from Brisbane summer and then training in the like 30-degree, it was only about 25, 30-degree heat when I left, going over to Las Vegas, where it was like a cool, dry air. I shaved 30 minutes or 45, I think it was 45 minutes off my marathon PB because I was in that cooler environment, wasn't overheating. It was like much, much easier to do it. And then coming back to Melbourne, where it was almost 15, 20 degrees hotter and just absolutely struggling in that heat coming from that cooler, because it is, thermoregulation is so, so, so important. Don't get me wrong. You need to be conditioned. You need to have a good fueling strategy. You need to understand your hydration. Conditioning is absolutely king, but thermoregulation and overheating is going to play such a huge role. And you see this a lot more in these hotter environments. You see it when people are racing these hotter environments. And you just think about how you run when it's in the winter in your city and how you run when it's in summer. You can probably go out and do a bit more, given that, like, don't get me wrong, if you're running, like I've run in Canada when it's -20, -25, there's different considerations that can be detrimental if you're running in the extreme cold. But if you're in like a normal person cold where it's like, I don't know, 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, you could probably go a lot further, a lot longer, because you're not going to overheat. It's such a huge, important consideration when we're talking about hydration and electrolytes. You just have to talk about thermoregulation as well, because it's just two parts of the same coin.
And I think as well, another point of why it's so important to understand your fluid losses is because you don't want to overdo it. So I think you kind of alluded to it before, but in terms of, consuming bulk plain water, whether that has electrolytes or not, you don't want to increase your risk of hyponatremia. So pretty much diluting the electrolytes that are in your blood, because it can have pretty bad consequences. So ultimately, our body is super smart at regulating body fluid and also electrolytes. So for example, when you do become dehydrated, you don't pee as much, or you don't sweat as much because you don't have as much fluid to get out. So our body tries to maintain homeostasis and kind of control these things. But if you're putting in, you're sweating, and you're just grabbing water from the aid station, or maybe you don't have enough electrolytes on your bike and you're just putting in water, you need to be really careful, because if you're already losing a lot of electrolytes through your sweat and you're just replacing that with water, you can increase your risk of, obviously, so what hyponatremia is we've got decreased sodium levels in our blood. And that can cause our swells. Oh my gosh, I need to talk properly. Our cells to swell up. And worst case scenario is that people can die from this. Obviously, it's very worst case scenario. The average Joe is probably not going to have to worry about it. But it is something super important to consider if you are training in those super hot environments, because when we sweat, we're not just sweating out water, we're sweating out electrolytes. So you need to make sure that you are, in a way, replacing what you're losing. Because if you're losing salt, and then you're just putting water in, you're just diluting. So it's like you've got a nice bucket of ocean water and you're pouring fresh creek water into it. You're obviously going to mix up the solution there. And it's not going to be optimal for that nerve signaling and the muscular contraction that we're trying to fuel by ensuring we're on top of our fluid and our sodium and our potassium.
Yeah, I think it was theorized in like the 60s or 70s that this could happen. And then, like, unfortunately, I think it was in somewhere, I want to say Sweden, or it was like Netherlands, or somewhere in that part of the world. It was the first time they saw it happen in a marathon, where it was a female athlete just overdrank. And essentially exactly what Loz said, right? Like, you sweat a lot, especially if you're competing in these hot, humid environments. You're a heavy sweater, you lose a lot of salt, you're losing all that sodium out from the blood, from the fluid in the blood, but then you're just putting in plain water without any of that sodium to replace what you've lost. It can dilute it and it can cause so many bad things. And one of the big things, it swells up these cells, and it can swell up your brain. It can swell up your brain, and you see people just drop into comas and they can unfortunately die. And there is a number of recorded cases, unfortunately, of people who overdrink. And that's another thing why it's so important to understand and get an individual hydration strategy, because you could listen to us and go, oh my God, like, I need to get way more fluid in, way more electrolytes. But maybe you don't. Maybe you're on the lower end of it and you're a low salt sweater and you're a low sweater, and you don't need to do that. You need to somehow come up with different cooling strategies by absolutely, you may be having cool drinks, slushies, ice hats, or whatever it is, stop you overheating. But you may not necessarily need to get liters and liters of fluid per hour or heaps of electrolytes in. You just need to understand what your individual requirements are and figure out how to start implementing them in your training. So come race day, whatever environment you're in, you're as best prepared as possible.
Mm-hmm. And I think that just triggered a thought. I was watching an Ironman a few weeks ago, and obviously, you know, we're not all lucky enough to train with a crew around us, but this one guy, he had someone on a bike with a weed sprayer filled with cold water and was spraying him while he was running. So if anyone needs some tips as to how to thermoregulate, that's the first thing that comes to mind for me, having a little posse with a weed sprayer and some cold water.
Yeah, I always do I get ice in my hat. Like I'll get like a bag of ice and I'll just put it like under my hat. And you can buy hats these days that you can like put ice packs in, and that's really cool.
Wow, that is 2022 for you.
Yeah, or you can get like in your running vest, like you can put like ice packs in your running vest, and whenever you get to a station or whatever, you can put new ice packs in. It makes a big difference. Like we spent this whole talk like talking about overheating, but there's like on the other end of that, we won't go into it too much, but like I've run in the extreme cold as well, where, you know, even breathing too deeply, you can literally burn your lungs by breathing in that cold air too much, and you've got to be rugged up, and it's a completely different ball game. But we'll go into that into a different episode. But I think, Loz, that pretty much covers everything that we wanted to go over.
Absolutely.
So yeah, everyone, if you're listening to this, that's a lot of info, and it's a very nuanced topic. Like, and I won't shy away from it. We don't have all the answers for it. Like we were talking about with cramps, we don't know what exactly causes cramps. We have an idea of what could cause it. And like I said, it's a shotgun approach. Like a lot of things when it comes to hydration, overheating, electrolytes, we understand that, yeah, there's probably going to be a performance benefit or detriment if you do or don't get it right. Do we know all of the innate details of that? Not quite yet, but we know that we need to do something, and you need to get an individual strategy for it. That's going to be your best bet if you are finding that you're experiencing symptoms, if you're getting low energy, if you're cramping, if you're finding that you're getting really fatigued, you're not recovering, you're not sleeping well. All of those things can be issues related to hydration and electrolytes. Can we nail it down to the exact one? Maybe, maybe not, but it's best to just make sure that you're ticking all of the boxes to make sure you're putting yourself in the best position possible to adapt to your training, to get more conditioned, to become a better athlete.
Absolutely. I think you summarized that perfectly.
All right, Loz, let's leave that one there, and we'll chat next time. I think what are we doing? The social Q&A to finish off the endurance series.
Yeah, I think we'll put it to the listeners.
All right. So if you are listening to this and you got all the way through, send us through any other questions from anything we've gone over in this series. Shoot it through to me and Loz, and then we'll go over it next episode.
Sounds good. See you, Jordy.
And there it is, another episode of the TFD Performance Podcast. That does it for our first installment of the endurance series. Like we said, we will be doing a listener Q&A to finish off, so keep an eye on our social media and send through all of your questions. This podcast will be available through the podcast app, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and if you follow along our socials at @the_fight dietitian, you can see all of the best bits from our podcast episodes. Thanks for listening in, and I'll see you guys for the next episode of the TFD Performance Podcast.